So good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kathy Shader, and I'm a consultant for the Marshfield Clinic Health System and the Wisconsin After School Network. I will be moderating this series of webinars, and we are pleased to be offering this learning series with the Marshfield Clinic Healthcare System and the Wisconsin Department of Administration. Today is the fourth webinar series. Today's fourth webinar series begins the first session of a four-part series on behavior interventions. This series was developed following a response to a needs assessment conducted by the Wisconsin After School Network this past fall. We are thrilled that Rachel Sharon of the Marshfield Clinic Center for Community Outreach is kicking off with this session on trauma-informed culture and supervision. And Rachel, I might have you introduce. I realized I didn't copy your text of your bio in my, my text. So anyhow, a few housekeeping items before we begin. Please keep your microphones on mute, and if you have questions, we will ask you to post those in the chat box, which the Marshfield Clinic staff will be monitoring. We will be fielding questions at the end of this presentation, but do not hesitate to put questions in the chat box so we can get to them after. As a reminder, this presentation is being recorded and will be sent to all registered participants in the next week. And so I'm going to introduce briefly, Rachel, to you all with that brief introduction. I'm going to let you do your bio since I seem to have not put it in front of me. So Rachel, I'll turn this over to you.
Thanks, Gabby. I think honestly, as a presenter, one of my least favorite parts is the part where you have to talk about yourself, but I will just say a little bit because I think it's relevant for today. I'm a social worker by training, and I currently work in the out-of-school time field with Wisconsin After School Network through the clinic, and I also do some direct service at one of our local out-of-school time programs here. But before that, I spent almost a decade in child protection, child welfare, where I was a direct worker and a supervisor as well. And so I share that with all of you because that's a big reason why I'm here today talking about trauma amongst our staff and our peers. And that's really where my passion comes from, because when we're in these caring professions and we deal with really tough situations every day, I want to make sure that we're advocating for everything that we can do to take care of ourselves and our staff and our teams. So that's kind of my impetus for being here today, and I'm excited to talk to all of you, especially coming out of a couple really hard years. This is a really important topic. So I will share my screen before I forget here. And then we will jump right in. So to kick us off today, I'd really like to start with just a quick opportunity for all of you to sit and reflect. And I've got a couple questions I'm just going to read to you and just be thinking about the program or programs you're most intimately involved with as I go ahead and read these. So first off, do my staff or the people that I work with feel safe when I go to work? And do I feel safe? Do my staff and the people I work with feel like we can trust one another? And do I feel like I can trust the people that I work with? Do the people I work with feel supported by their peers? And do I feel supported by my peers? Do the people I work with feel that they have a voice and a choice in their work with the kids and the families? And do I feel like I have any choice or say in the work with kids and families? And does the entire team feel like we have a culture that's inclusive and supportive? And those are really questions intended for you, again, to reflect personally and to be thinking about your programs individually. But it's a really good starting point because essentially that has outlined the rest of what we're going to talk about today. And really creating a trauma-informed culture and creating trauma-informed staff, support for staff that we work with is really about that safety, inclusivity, and how those things all kind of run together. So really good to kind of have that informal assessment of your program as we go forward today and be thinking about some of these concepts. All right, so as Kathy kind of alluded, Wisconsin After School Network has been doing a lot of work this year assessing the needs of out-of-school time providers and then responding to some of those biggest needs being around compassion fatigue, trauma, burnout. And we also did a recent work around some focus groups where we talked to individual programs and groups of programs, really interviewed how people are feeling in the field. So these are anonymous quotes, but I wanted to share with all of you what you are saying about this topic and really kind of hit home where a lot of people are feeling we're at with burnout and high levels of stress and trauma. So some people are saying we're on high alert all the time. Kind of the red flags, the warning signs, they're going off all the time. We have tougher kids than we ever have before with higher needs. So how do we deal with that? Stress levels are very high and people are choosing carefully what they can take on and what battles they fight. So they might be showing up every day, they're trying their best, but they can't do everything maybe that they once did, and they're having to choose between what they can tackle first. Staff are calling in sometimes, and sometimes they're not even calling in at all. They're just not showing up. So you're seeing burnout just in how they're responding and whether or not you have staff to even fill your quota for the day. The level of burnout with those working with you is incredibly high. New staff aren't even lasting sometimes a week, and there's a mental health disparity. So new staff, maybe younger staff, aren't understanding how to take care of themselves and make sure their needs are met. And there's disillusionment. There's burnout, and it's definitely prevalent. So when we think back to that previous slide, really a lot is trauma. And trauma is a buzzword, definitely, and it's gaining momentum. There's more and more studies about it, but there's still kind of this perception that trauma involves like one event. It might be a hurricane in a community, and that's kind of the trauma, or a big disaster like that takes place, or someone experiences a car crash in their life, and that's what trauma is defined as in a lot of people's minds. And those are definitely qualifiers for traumatic experiences, and people go through the related stressors and after effects of those things. But according to Bruce Perry's work, which he is a big researcher in the trauma field, he describes trauma in a more nuanced way, where we have these big T traumas that are events and one-time situations. But he also talks about this pattern of activation stress that leads to overactivity and reactivity. So what this means is that repeated stress over time, day in, day out, even though it's not a big event, can actually have the same effects on our bodies and our emotional well-being and our state of mind that a big T trauma might as well. And so if maybe there was question before about is what our staff really experiencing trauma, this kind of helps put that into perspective. And if you think back to our previous slide with some of those bubbles, you can see where people are kind of describing these ongoing kind of continual stressors that they're experiencing, and how added up that can really truly be experienced as a trauma in the mind and the body over time. So right now I'm going to have our media person start to share the beginning of a video with us, and this video that we're going to come back to a couple of different times throughout the presentation. So we're going to take a couple clips. This is Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky, and she has done a lot of work in trauma and direct service and then kind of studying the field. So she's a really good resource. We'll start with the first part of her clip now.
18 years ago, I found myself standing on top of a very tall cliff, having what I would only come to recognize many years later as a near psychotic break. It would be fair for you to ask if I had always been that on edge, and the answer is no. But as many of you, I imagine, can relate to, how I found myself on top of that cliff on that particular day was by way of a very long road. Like so many others, my childhood was filled with a lot of love and many challenges. Life came into particularly sharp focus for me when I was 10 years old. My mom, who was the healthiest person any of us knew, went into a doctor's appointment for what everyone thought would be a diagnosis of pneumonia at the worst, and returned home having been told she had a very rare form of lung cancer. They gave her 3 months to live. She lived for 3 years, much of that time with one lung. And so she died when I was 13, and the sun rose and set with my mom, and I entered into my adolescence feeling if continuing to live wasn't going to be impossible, it was going to be highly improbable. So I navigated high school with a lot of overachieving. I spent my days getting straight A's and working 3 jobs, and I spent my nights planning on how I could end my life without causing my older brother, who'd always been my protector and my role model, too much pain. I did make it through high school, and then I landed in college, and I found myself sitting in one of those very large lecture halls, and my professor at the time, Professor Richard Applebaum, was talking to us about suffering on this one particular morning. In particular, he was talking about homelessness. And he was talking about it in a way that allowed time to stand still for me. He was building on what so many traditions have taught us since the beginning of time, really, that in life, it is said, there's equal measure of brutality and beauty, of pain and pleasure, of annihilating moments and of sublime moments. And yet there was a way he was talking about it, this whole conversation about equanimity, that was completely new to me. Because during those 3 years when my brother and I were taking care of our mom, we were surrounded by a number of very, very loving people and kind people who gave us a lot of support for appearing to be stoic, for seeming to be strong, and for holding it all together. And what Professor Applebaum was talking about on that morning is when one is engaged in suffering, there is so much more to it than holding it all together. So what I knew was I wanted more of whatever he had going on. So I went up to him after class, asked how I could help. He scribbled on a piece of paper the name and number of our local homeless shelter's director. And that's when I started volunteering at age 18, spending the nights regularly volunteering in a homeless shelter. I went on to work with all forms of trauma, and always within this kind of larger backdrop of systematic oppression and liberation theory. And what I knew was that I was so grateful that I had found something that made sense to me and that I felt passionate about. What I had no idea, and wouldn't know for years to come, was to what degree, having borne witness to the suffering of my mom and then the subsequent years of bearing witness to so much suffering with so many people, to what degree that was taking a toll on me. And this is something that wise people have passed down for a long time, and we know more and more about now because of the advances in neuroscience and the wonderful research that many of my esteemed colleagues are doing. But at the time, I had no idea about this cumulative toll. So one of the ways that the toll can show up is for those of you who are doing work. There are folks who do work, and as a result of the work you do, you might be exposed to things, either because of the content of what you're doing, but what a lot of my colleagues say is like, look, the work itself is the least of my concern. It's all my colleagues who put me over the edge.
I'll just go ahead and share again here so we can get back to our slides. All right. So Laura does a really great job here depicting some of the reasons that people in caring professions get into the field and how a lot of us come from complicated backgrounds, and that's what makes the love for what we do so great. And it also kind of adds on to maybe some of the struggles that we see when we have stress added onto our plates in the field. And she does a really good job there in the beginning of starting to talk about how stress over time really starts to compound. Can everyone see my slide again?
Yeah, you're good, Rachel.
Okay, it's looking a little different on my end, so I just wanted to make sure. So she kind of articulates how those things add up and we don't always see it coming. And so a lot of times the tendency is to kind of grin and bear it and get through because the work we're doing, right, is so worth it and we're here for a higher purpose and a higher reason. And so we usually kind of struggle through that, not really seeing how things are adding up. So when we're thinking about how to support our peers, our teams, or those that we kind of lead or supervise, it's helpful to think about how this work actually impacts us so we can start to identify some of the warning signs. So this is taken from the triad of traumatic stress, and this can be helpful because you can start to think about if staff or yourself, your teams, are exhibiting some of these changes. You might see changes in their view about themselves, about the world, and about the future. So let's break it down a little bit and look at these examples. and the out of school time field, and you guys can feel free to add things in the chat as we go if you think of other examples. But things where people might be experiencing some changes in views about themselves, you might hear them saying, I can't work with this kid. And that's not something they probably said before. I don't have energy to plan. I'm going to show up and we're going to do our routine, but I don't have any energy behind. I can't teach that. I can stick to what I've always done, but I can't take on that extra thing right now. I just can't, right? And I wish I could see faces because I'm guessing there would be some head nods recognizing that some of these things are coming up in the field. When we talk about views changing about our world, you hear people saying, this program isn't safe, they don't care about us, so it becomes kind of an us versus them, staff versus leadership, and things like that kind of start to brew. I have a plan. I have to plan everything because my team won't help me. So I'm the only one taking on this burden and feeling really isolated. Who knows what will walk through that door? Kids are just out of control. Like, we've given up about trying to plan around and support kids, and we're just, our hands are up in the air and we've kind of given up on that. And then our views about the future have also become pretty pessimistic. So we're never going to make up for the learning loss that we've seen during the pandemic, or the behaviors are just getting worse and we have to put up with it. So the overall idea here is that there's a shift in lens. So people are talking more about how they don't have control over the situation. They're feeling isolated. So you start to kind of see these patterns pop up if people are experiencing traumatic stress or that ongoing stress. It's also helpful if you're leading a team of people to think about the impact that ongoing stress or traumatic stress has on the body, because that can help you cue into maybe possible warning signs where we might need to help out as well. So as this slide articulates here, trauma can deeply affect staff's physiology, the chemical makeup in their brain. And when individuals experience chronic stress, literally the neural networks restructure in our brain. And this is all because our body is designed to protect us. And so if we're experiencing stress when we show up to programming day in, day out, our bodies are going to kind of go into protection mode and rewire in order to make us survive in those situations. Also, we'll hear staff starting to talk about some of these other impacts. They might be experiencing some stomach troubles. They might be saying they've got some reports coming back from the doctor that aren't as positive. They're feeling really tired and exhausted. Somatization, so people might be having a backache they might not have had before. They might be eating more, they might be eating less. We all kind of respond differently to these things, but those changes in how we function and just even get our basic needs met would be big indicators that we could all look out for and then help support each other if we're noticing those things. I have just over a 2-year-old at home, and a couple months back she went through a phase where if she was really tired or going through a growth spurt and was really cranky, she would tell her dad or me that she needed us to take her temperature or she needed Tylenol. And don't worry, we weren't just administering Tylenol every time she said she needed it. But I thought about it, and after the fact, I thought this is a really genius thing because she is experiencing discomfort. She's tired or she's not feeling the best. And she had a way of articulating that she physically needed something to meet her needs. And by no means is this an egregious example or anything like that. She's got it pretty cush, if I do say so myself. But I thought about how over time in our culture, we're socialized to ignore those things and to no longer speak up about those things. And so not only do we not advocate for ourselves when we're stressed out in our careers and in our field, but we don't even know how to identify things anymore ourselves. So to take that analogy a little further, it would be great if we could all help support each other in asking for the Tylenol when we need it or asking for our temperatures to be taken. And so that kind of ties into this idea that the very basic makeup of our bodies is changing when we're stressed out. And so sometimes we do need to kind of administer that first aid, so to speak. So other ways you're going to notice that stress is showing up in staff is you're going to see it in the burnout. You're going to see it in the traumatic stress, compassion fatigue, and moral injury. And these terms tend to run together, but it's helpful to pause and just kind of delineate them here. So burnout is really talking about that exhaustion piece. Like people go home and they can't do anything but sit on the couch. Like making supper is a big deal for them, right? And we've all probably had moments where we felt that and can kind of relate to that. Secondary traumatic stress is really when you're working with a kid or a client or a family and you start to have the reactions that they have by listening to their story or seeing the struggles that they're having. So if a kid is running out of programming every day and really having a breakdown, you start to experience the same things they feel in their body because you're almost kind of living that trauma with them. And then compassion fatigue is really the combination of those two things. So you're burnt out, you don't have any energy, and you're also experiencing that added on stress. So it's really getting to a crucial point when people are experiencing that compassion fatigue. And then moral injury kind of ties into a couple slides where we address like the worldview changing. So, people might have started working in after school where they really thought like all kids are possible of change and improvement and learning, but they start to think maybe other things about kids that aren't as optimistic. And their whole view changes. Like we can't make a difference in these kids' lives. And so those are all things that we need to be on the lookout for. And these are the times and the points when people are experiencing these extreme levels of stress where you do start to see a reduced commitment to the work. So maybe there's some absenteeism or they're not planning the same way in programming that they used to. There's just not that same level of commitment. Those negative attitudes are bubbling up, whether it's towards leadership or other staff or kind of the whole agency mission. Like we're never going to kind of make a difference here. And then it leads to a damaged team morale. So you start to see turnover and overall dissatisfaction. The point of these slides isn't, again, to like belabor the worries, but just to make sure that you all can identify the warning signs in your staff or in your teams, and we can hopefully prevent things from getting to that point, but also to recognize that if these things are coming up with teammates or with other staff, that they shouldn't be blamed either, right? There's a whole context for why they're getting to this point, and a lot of it is out of their control and feels out of their control. And so just like when we talk about kids from a trauma-informed lens, we're also going to talk about staff and teammates from a trauma-informed lens, and that really they're just having a normal reaction to some really crappy situations and a lot of stress going on in programming or in the communities that we serve. So we've got another clip from Laura to kind of highlight this next piece for us.
Right? So sometimes the toll is because of the work. Sometimes the toll is because of the caretaking we do on our lives. Here she's saying, I feel like I need you less and less, Mom, now that I can make myself feel guilty all on my own. So much of the toll we feel is because many of you are caretaking in your personal lives. You're caretaking those around you. You're at home tending for folks who are returning from wars, folks who are ill, people who are in need in the community. Sometimes the toll we feel is because of the suffering of other living beings. This is Chris Jordan's wonderful work. And sometimes it's because of what's going on ecologically on the planet itself. This is the work of Vance Friedenberg. He's one of the leading scientists looking at the sixth mass extinction. But what we know is that when humans are exposed to suffering, hardship, crisis, trauma of humans, other living beings, or the planet itself, there's a cumulative toll. And there's a toll on us individually, there's a toll on your immediate relationships, there's a toll organizationally for those of you who have this exposure in your work, institutionally, systemically. We see it in movements we're a part of, we're seeing it throughout all of our communities and society as a whole. She's saying, speaking personally, I haven't had my day and I've never met any dog who has. The other piece of this that's very important, at least when I do this work, is it's always held in a larger context of systematic oppression. You know this so well, but a reminder that the degree to which you're impacted by the lives you're living and the work you're doing is intimately tied to the fact that we're in a society with so much supremacy. And if we're in a society where there's no oppression, there's no racism, sexism, homophobia, heterosexism, ageism, ableism, classism, and xenophobia, so much of the suffering we are tending to wouldn't exist, and the remaining bits that exist in life, we would all be affected by that so differently. I have no doubt that all of you have so much more insight and personal awareness than I did back in the day, and that for those of you who know what this toll is and when you feel this toll, either because of what's going on in your personal lives or on the job, that you're able to identify it. But I was not at all able to identify it. So it was about 10 years into my career when a critical mass of people started kind of getting up in my face doing that, "Hey Laura, you're tripping, you should take some time off." And I'm sure somebody said something earlier than 10 years in, but I was very stubborn and successfully ignored them. But 10 years in is when there was a critical mass of people up in my grill really begging me to look at this. And what some of you will appreciate is that a number of those people were clients I was serving, which you can imagine is always so disconcerting. You know, survivors of domestic violence living in a shelter who can't go anywhere, begging me not to come to work. So people were doing their due diligence, right? But at the time, I was so arrogant, I was incredibly cocky, and I was entirely self-righteous. I was you could either step up and help me do God's work, or you could step off. But I was definitely not going to have a conversation with you about how I was affected by my. And like many of you possibly, I was raised in a number of traditions that implicitly and explicitly communicated, if you care enough about what you're doing, if you are down with your cause enough, if it matters enough to you, you're going to suck it up. So this whole conversation about how to sustain was not something I was engaging in. But finally, the pressure mounted. I caved. I didn't take any significant time off, but compromised. We took a short trip, went to visit our family who lived in the Caribbean. So on a particular day, we head out as a family on this hike, and we get halfway through our hike, and we summit what we wanted to summit, and there we are standing on the top of these cliffs, right? So the family's gathered around, tiny Caribbean island, standing on the top of these cliffs, looking out. The first thing I remember thinking was, this is so beautiful. The second thing I immediately thought was, I wonder how many people have killed themselves by jumping off of these cliffs, right? And at the time, I worked at Harborview Hospital, which you know is the level 1 trauma center for the whole Northwest. So it wasn't my own suicidality at play anymore. It was because of the years of bearing witness to others suffering that naturally, instinctually, one starts triaging, of course, right? So you start thinking, where would the helicopter land? Does the helicopter land on the cliff, and would you belay down to the person on the beach? Would the helicopter actually land on the beach? Is there a level 1 trauma center in the Caribbean, you ask yourself? Do they fly you to Miami? Would they stop you in customs? You know, you kind of go through the whole thing, right? So I said this out loud because I was merely presuming I was just giving voice to inevitably what was going to come up in a family conversation, because who stands on top of a cliff and does not wonder where the nearest level 1 trauma center is? But apparently in my family, nobody was thinking that. So it got even quieter than it had been. Really long, very uncomfortable pause happened. And ultimately it was my stepfather-in-law who said, you sure all this trauma work hasn't gotten to you? And honestly, this was the first moment I had any insight into, check it out. There are people who can go on a hike and not wonder where the nearest level 1 trauma center is. But I'll tell you, it wasn't me, it wasn't anybody I was hanging out with, right? Because one of the things about this toll is it's slow moving. It is very hard to gauge over time, individually and collectively, if we are being affected by what we're exposed to. And also what happens is we get very isolated. So this was one of those moments that maybe you've had where kind of everything starts flooding in, right? And then I was like, oh, well, if this is the case, maybe it's also the case that there's people who still date out there in the world, and those people who date aren't doing background checks on everybody they date, right? Maybe there's people who can go
All right, so here again, Laura does a really great job of providing some examples on how chronic stress and trauma really could impact staff in the caring professions, like in out of school time. And I like how she depicts how easily it adds up without us even noticing. Like it gets to that point where you might feel dramatically on a cliff, so to speak, and it's not until that point that you realize maybe not everyone is having the same thoughts. And given the work that she did, the staff that we're working with might not have the same exact experiences. They're not working in a trauma hospital or a domestic violence shelter, but they might be having experiences where they go to the grocery store with their families and I bet that kid has, ADHD and oppositional defiant. They might start to kind of assess those things, or, kind of have those instincts, and they're working on that off time, and that again kind of shifts their whole worldview and starts to make them feel isolated, because those aren't thoughts that everyone around them are having, but we start to have in our caring professions because we're getting exposed to so many stressors and helping to solve so many complex problems every day with those kids and families that we're working with. So before we move on, I wanted to give you all an opportunity to participate here. We don't have a lot of breaks like that planned for today's session, but I think there's a lot of value in all of you learning from one another and sharing information. So before I kind of move towards what can we do about this and how do we support each other, I want to see if you guys have ideas. So in the chat, just sharing what you might already be doing for staff or with your team that really helps to buffer against that chronic stress that we're talking about, or some of the vicarious trauma that we're talking about. So feel free to enter those, please.
Rachel, you can see the chat okay?
I actually cannot
Okay.
see it anymore. Is there
I
anything
can-
going in,
I can
Kathy?
be your eyes. Right now, nothing. No. Don't
Okay.
be shy, everybody.
Anything coming in, Kathy?
Nope, I'm not seeing anything.
Okay.
People
Well,
are
please
quiet.
continue to, I was just going to say, please enter stuff as we continue going, because the next slides might even spark some ideas, or you might have some deeper ideas. So we'll go ahead and move on, but please participate. I think there's a lot of value in all of us kind of being a community here together, especially given the topic. So please share your thoughts as we go along. So a big part about making sure we're addressing trauma is that we have to shift the culture of our entire agency. And I have on here, hint, it takes more than a seminar or training. And I put that up there partially because I've been guilty of going to a training on trauma or watching a video that's inspiring, like Laura Vanderlipsky, like the one we're working through today, and kind of coming back and being really optimistic, like I'm going to change the world and we can do this and we can shift the whole approach of what we're doing. But it takes more than that one person. It takes more than that one training, and it really is almost a global shift for your agency that has to happen if you're going to provide trauma-informed support and supervision to staff. So we're going to walk through each of these areas here. So in order to really fully address the whole culture, we have to take a look at organizational screening. So we'll break it down. One of the areas we want to make sure we're really cognizant of is the consumer behavior. So the kids, the families that we're working with, we want to make sure we're gauging things like, who are we retaining? Who, unfortunately, do we have to kick out of programming, and making sure if there's certain characteristics or demographics even, that we're paying attention to those things. And if the reasons kids aren't staying in our program or families aren't as engaged are potentially related to some of the trauma experiences they have, and we're gauging those things and we're being honest about them and we're reporting out on them to staff, to our leadership, and even being willing to do that with the community. We also want to make sure that we're gauging just overall engagement. So are families taking the resources we offer? Are they coming to our family nights? What does that look like, to make sure that what we're offering matches the need of those that we're serving? Another area that we really want to look out for in organizational screening is assessing staff knowledge and then providing the training to back up where we see gaps. So we're looking at things like, our staff talking about kids from a trauma-informed lens? Are they really taking that perspective that kids are responding normally to really adverse situations? Do they take that approach, or are we blaming the victim in those situations? And then again, are we committing ourselves to following up, providing support, providing training, and then hands-on experience where we're giving feedback and we're modeling that ourselves? And another part of the staff piece is also monitoring the level of turnover amongst our staff and asking for feedback when people leave, and taking that feedback seriously and into consideration as well. And then we want to adapt our policy and the way we collect data. So in order to be trauma informed, truly, like we want this to be embedded in the very mission of what we do. We want it to be in all of our guiding behaviors, principles, everything that we do to respond to kids and families. We want to make sure we're also considering trauma exposure that kids have, how we're responding to that in a positive way and in a supportive way, what resources we offer, and monitoring those things as well. And then again, following up and being willing to report that information back to whether that's our leadership or even our staff directly. And then also gauging what other community relationships do we have and what are we a part of? Because most counties and most areas have some sort of group that's focused on targeting trauma, mental health needs in the community. And are we a part of those larger conversations? So are we coming with input and what we're seeing in our programming? Are we advocating? Are we learning about other interventions that are going on? So really be engaged in that overall effort to combat trauma and the situations that families are in that make it more likely that they'll experience trauma in our communities. And so really being an advocate and a leader in that area and holding ourselves accountable that way too is a way that we shift our culture overall. So shifting culture includes a whole paradigm shift. So the way I like to think about this is trauma-informed agencies have a really strong philosophy that's tied into the trauma-informed principles, but they also have concrete tools that they operationalize every day that carry out that philosophy as well. So I have this picture here as an example. When you walk in the door, no matter who you are, no matter where you came from, you are beautiful. To me, this is a very trauma-informed message. And there wouldn't be any question in my mind if I walked in and this was the front wall in a school or in an after-school program that was part of their mission and their agenda. It's literally in front of your face. And that's what you start to see in trauma-informed agencies, that it's on every poster, it's on every message. It's there in front of you, and there's no question that that's a priority for them. But again, they take it beyond just the signage and some of those more superficial things. The messaging is important, but you truly start to see it carried out in their practice. So I was really fortunate when I was in child welfare to work for one of the leaders in the state of trauma-informed care. And they were an agency where when you walk in the door, you feel safe, you feel welcome, you see this messaging. But they did a really good job of operationalizing this in practice. And so what they would do in child welfare when a team would get a new case is they would instantly, first thing before going into planning or doing anything with a family, they would staff the case and talk about trauma and how many trauma exposures they knew the children, the bio parents, the foster parents had been through, and then talk through how that was potentially impacting functioning for that family and that child. And then even talk about things like caregiver capacity. So anyone involved in giving care to that child, talking about their ability to cope with all of that, because it can be a lot, as we're talking about, to hold space for somebody that's struggling and to deal with those stressors every day. And so talking about that. And even the case management team involved, like where was the social work team on that scale and what did they need for support? And then those conversations were embedded throughout the case. And you could also see those conversations filtering into things like court reports. So these conversations filtered into courtrooms, and there was conversation around trauma-informed care there, and it filtered into case planning and considerations for resource referral. And so you can see where that would have a huge impact on a child and a family if we're taking that lens. And that feedback loop would then help the agency to be even more trauma-informed, and it had a very positive cyclical result. And they're really important about an important topic around culture and trauma-informed care is this idea of wellness and self-care. And I throw up the 8 dimensions of wellness. This is a visual we use a lot of times in our Wisconsin After School Network trainings. And I put it up here again because it really highlights the importance of considering all the different areas of wellness, because even though this is something admittedly that I talk about almost every day in my direct service or I know that my bias when I think of wellness is always exercise and diet, and that's where my mind goes, and I think that's what our culture trains us to do a lot of the time. But wellness is so much more, includes things like spiritual wellness, environmental wellness, and so we have to kind of have awareness of that and how that balance is going to be different for all the staff that we work with or that we lead. So that's one thing that I wanted to mention here. The other thing that I wanted to mention too is there's kind of been a tendency when having these conversations to almost have like a false idea of wellness that, you know, it's just a matter of making a self-care plan and you can kind of take care of yourself. And what that does, without also making sure we're creating a supportive system to back that up, is it really places blame on the victim. So we have staff that are experiencing really stressful situations day in, day out. And we're telling them, like, don't worry, as long as you go do your exercise and your yoga after programming, you'll be fine and you'll be able to be replenished for the next day. And where there's a very important part of wellness that needs to be placed all, we also have to make sure that we're addressing wellness back at our agencies and in our programs so that we're creating situations where they're not burnt out going home. Because we're talking about the level of stress where if someone really is burnt out and all they can do when they go home is just sit and binge Netflix in order to make it through the next day, they're not going to be able to carry out that wellness. And that's really putting them in a situation where then they're also blaming themselves for not meeting these demands, but they weren't set up for success to begin with. So I put a couple things up here very specifically that our program do. So one of them is around flexibility. And this might seem like in this day and age with staffing shortages, it might be an impossibility. But I put it up here because there's always small areas where we can be flexible as staff. And this is an area where staff report that it really helps diminish the impact of stress and burnout. So we're talking about the difference if you have the ability between offering 5 8s in a week and 4 10s to do that if you can, so that people have that option. And that's going to be a different personal choice for everybody, what makes the most sense. But if we have the ability to do that and offer flexibility, that could make a big impact for someone that has a family at home or another person that they're taking care of. I also put self-care and mindfulness up here because those are also buzzwords. I think we often think of it stereotypically as sitting on a mat at a yoga retreat. And we can do exercises with staff where they don't even know that that's mindfulness. We can play everyone's favorite song in the beginning of staffing. We can do that while we're prepping for programming. So again, these little tiny things that don't take a lot of time or a lot of effort, but they have a huge impact on morale and they can help provide energy. And again, we are sending the message that we care about you and we're trying to make this place a comfortable one where you can deal with your stress as well. We're not leaving you hanging to figure it out all by yourself. And then the coverage and overall staff support plans. So really recommending that everyone has a conversation with their teams or those that they're supervising to talk about the difference between stress and overwhelm. Because I think we've all probably experienced both of those things. Stress are those days where things are kind of adding up. You can't do it all on your own, but you're able to think about a plan. So you can go to your team and say, you know what, I'm going to deal with so-and-so in the corner. They're kind of having a breakdown over there, but I need you to grab that group of kindergartners because it looks like they're getting kind of out of control, and I need you to go set up the next activity. So you're stressed out, but you know how you can get through it. You know how to ask for help. Very helpful to have conversations with your team about what it looks like for you when you're getting stressed out and how you deal with it. And then vice versa, so that everyone can share and kind of have a plan in place for when those times come up. And then overwhelm. Overwhelm is a word that's overused. I know I use it every day, like I'm so overwhelmed. But overwhelm is to the point where you can't even think of that plan. You don't even know how to ask for help. You need to get out of that situation to regulate yourself. And so it's also important for teams to have those conversations about what it looks like for you if you're overwhelmed and what you would need. So I know we don't always have a lot of options where staff can just walk outside, but maybe there's a smaller version of taking a break that they can go get a drink of water. They can maybe go with a certain group of kids that are regulated and have some downtime. We need to be able to give our staff those opportunities to regulate themselves so that they can meet the kids appropriately. Another really important part of this cultural shift when we think about trauma-informed care is that we're including everyone. So I think traditionally hierarchies are set up that a lot of decisions are made at the top by fewer people involved. But in order to give back some of that power that people feel they're missing when they're going through stress and feeling like they're not in control, is making sure they're a part of decisions, they're able to give feedback. So part of what your rounding should be all the time with staff is going and requesting for information and genuinely considering it. And then being transparent about how that information was processed and what you're going to do with it. We're not always able to meet the demands of every single staff's request, obviously, but just being transparent what we can and can't do and why gives information and power back to the staff, and it helps them feel included. And another piece about this too is making sure that we're screening all staff for trauma exposure. So not necessarily waiting till people are to that overwhelmed state that we talked about in that last slide, or that stressed out state, but periodically throughout the year, throughout our programming, we're assessing people. And this isn't something that you guys have to create out of thin air. There's tools out there, one of them being the professional quality of life scale that is a validated self-assessment that a lot of agencies use, and they periodically give to staff, and that helps you gauge where they're at in their compassion fatigue and burnout. So monitoring those things and then knowing that you can intervene much sooner than waiting till things are out of control is very impactful, and it's a way to include everyone. So now that we've created a whole culture that's trauma-informed, we want to talk about how do we have those tough conversations, whether it's with a peer, with someone that we supervise or lead, or a team. And that is an easier process said than done, so we kind of want to break it down, because trauma-informed supervision and leadership involves all the main elements of trauma-informed care. And we'll go through each one of these here. Kathy, before I move on, is there anything coming up in the chat at all?
Nope, and I've made a comment there too. If you have any questions, feel free to throw those in the chat box and Rachel will address those.
Okay, thanks, Kathy. All right, so the first area we want to talk about when we're meeting and having those really hard one-on-one or small group conversations is this idea of safety. And safety can be a really gauzy, ambiguous term, so it's helpful to even break that down further into these different areas. So when we're meeting with people, we want to make sure that we're providing that psychological safety. And there's a number of different ways to do that. But one of the biggest ways is going back to that idea of having transparent conversations. So a lot of times when a staff member comes to you or a team member comes to you, and it's to the point where we have to make a decision and it's stressing us out to the level where we're experiencing this trauma that we've been talking about, there's usually a very tough decision that has to be made, or there's potentially an ethical dilemma involved. And so in order for staff to feel psychologically safe in those conversations, we have to be honest about what we might have to do with that information. So unfortunately, sometimes that involves making a decision about whether a kid can stay in programming, and we have to be upfront about that so that they know. And that's not to deter them from sharing, but just to be honest, and so that they're not caught off guard later. Or if this is something that we have to run up even higher leadership, or we have to report to our board, or whatever that might look like, we need to make sure that the staff are aware of that, because knowing what you're going to do with that information builds that trust with them. So another important part about safety is providing that emotional safety, and some of these might seem like they kind of blur together. But the part here is making sure that people are feeling comfortable overall, right? And so a really good way to actually operationalize this is providing some sort of question that you ask staff every single time that you meet with them. So that way it becomes almost like a ritual and they kind of know what to expect, and there's that consistency, just like our kids in programming and our families crave that consistency. So do we, and so do staff that we work with. So I know when I was a child welfare supervisor, the scaling question I used every week was 0 to 10. 10 is I'm going to retire in this field. Everything's great. I have everything I need, and 0 is I can't believe I'm here. I don't know what's going on, and would kind of gauge them that way. And sometimes we would switch what the question was, but always that 0 to 10. And that way they knew that question was coming. They knew I was monitoring from week to week how they were doing. And that question isn't going to work for everybody, but the point being that we ask that ritual question every time we keep that consistency. And then in addition to talking about tough situations, we're always checking in with the staff and making sure that's a priority. That's really essentially what provides that emotional safety.
Rachel, there is a question that kind of connects to that, if I can ask it.
Yeah.
So what suggestions do you have to address staff's need for time and safety, excuse me, when you need them working with children due to regulations or policy?
That's a really good question. Because a lot of what I'm talking about does require that time, and it's a logistical barrier for sure. I know in out-of-school time programs, more than probably many other caring professions, we're stuck in these situations where we don't have a lot of time to meet for an hour every week or to get that fit in. So I think it's going to look different for every program, and it's probably going to look different for every staff. But I think it would probably be helpful to have those conversations with the individual staff about what works for them. Because you're right, we have to meet ratio, we have to meet licensing requirements. So we have to be able to have those conversations in different ways and asking what their availability is. And this is another good question too, because it's a point where if any of you have power in advocating to make sure staff are paid for that time, I know that's also a barrier as well. But it's important that they have that prep time and that debrief time going in, and that we need to compensate them too so that they're rewarded for doing that, and we're reinforcing what we're asking for as well. So I would recommend whenever possible meeting one-on-one with staff regularly, whether that's every other week or week. But then there's also ways to have those conversations and fit them in too. So one of the things I do with staff is make sure I get there before programming starts. And we have those conversations as we're setting up tables and cleaning and doing those things. So there's opportunities throughout the day that you can have those conversations that's not necessarily in front of kids as well. But it's a real barrier that we all are going to have to work through. So that's another one where I would encourage, if people have had successes too, other specifics to throw in the chat as we go as well. Thank you for that question. So the other area that kind of fits in with these ideas of safety we've been talking about is that moral safety. And this is where we accomplish this by practicing what we preach. So we're not telling staff that, come on into my office, we want to be trauma-informed, we want to help you debrief. But then when we talk about a tough situation, like, oh, that kid, they're never going to change. We want to also have that mentality and demonstrate when we're talking about families and kids that we also have that scope and that lens in all of the work we're doing. So again, it runs all the way through our agency, from programming, planning, behind closed door conversations. We're consistent, because if we're talking about families that way, then staff can trust that we're also truly wanting to treat them in that same fashion as well. And then social safety is a big part of this as well, because a lot of times staff or other peers come to us with these dilemmas and we don't have all the answers to them. And this kind of circles back to the question in the chat too, because we can often get stuck in these conversations that could go on for days or weeks, but we don't always have all the answers. And so another area to kind of monitor as you're having these conversations is the social safety. So being willing to be vulnerable and say when it's beyond your expertise, and bringing in someone else that might have some more information or some new fresh ideas. That creates social safety, as well as sometimes staff just feel more comfortable when they have a friend and a peer with them having tough conversations. So kind of gauging that and always offering if they would be more comfortable to have other people at the table. So those are a couple concrete ways you can operationalize that as well. And then physical safety. This is maybe one of the more black and white ones, but just making sure we're doing things like, if it's a delicate, doing the due diligence of closing the door and having a private conversation. I think we've all probably been in work environments where we've heard conversations amongst others that we probably shouldn't have heard, and they probably should have been kept more confidential. And that's a big part of making sure people feel safe, is that they're not having hard conversations in front of peers that would maybe be embarrassing. And then we're also not having conversations about other staff with staff that don't need to know that information, and keeping boundaries that way as well. So you guys can see how these are all starting to kind of lead into each other. They kind of build on each other, because another big component of this supervision, this leadership piece, is building that trust and transparency. So we err on the side of communication. We say why we're making decisions. It's not always what people want to hear, but hear it from us and know why, than hearing about it after the fact and always wondering why we made that decision. So here's another example where I'm going to ask you all to participate. We've got a scenario here. So you're worried about one of your staff who's responding to a child's resistance to follow directions. This is a simple situation we probably all see every day. You see them paying more attention to this child and correcting them continually throughout the day. And they offer directives over positive alternatives that the student or the child may be trying. And they make the increasingly dysregulated. So how do we handle this scenario in a way that's transparent but still supportive to the staff? So I'd like to see some comments in the chat box from this one.
I don't see anything listed yet, Rachel.
Nothing?
Nope.
Okay. All right. Well, as before, please contribute if you think of other things. And I think sometimes these questions are hard because you might think I'm maybe trying to trick you, but I'm really looking for ideas like, we're obviously going to pull them aside, right? We're going to have a conversation in a comfortable situation. We're not going to have it in front of the kids. Maybe we do get to programming that and we meet our staff on site to have that conversation. We're asking them their perspective, right? So going back to that idea, everyone is included. We're seeing what's going on, because it sounds like if they are responding to this kid this much, they probably have some worries that they've identified, and we can help work them through that. And then really having an honest conversation about what your worry is. And you can always ask for feedback if what you're interpreting is correct, but being with them so that they know what they need to work on as well. And that's that trust and transparency. So it's just to hit home the point that we might have to have these hard conversations, and they might not feel trauma-informed, but the idea is we do have them on the front end. And ultimately, that gives that awareness and that openness and that trust that we want to build in these environments. Another big one that we kind of have been referencing but haven't hit on is this idea of peer support. So a lot of what we've been talking about is these like one-on-one interactions, but a huge part of providing support is making sure peers have opportunities to come together. So this is another logistical hurdle for sure, especially if you're involved in a program that has multiple sites. But whenever possible at staffings, offering opportunities for people to debrief tough situations is really key here. And I have this quote up here: people don't always need advice. Sometimes all they really need is a handhold, ear to listen, and a heart to understand them. And that's really mostly what we're talking about here. We don't want conversations to just become complaints and venting, but we do want to give people space to say, like, I was in a really tough situation. I don't know how to handle it. Because like our videos have really demonstrated, when you're experiencing that ongoing trauma and stress, you start to feel isolated. Even though many of your peers are probably going through similar feelings or have comparable things that might be helpful, you feel isolated. So this is an opportunity for others to say, oh my gosh, that sucks. I've been through that. And then from there, you can engage in more productive problem solving. And I threw up this 3 columns tool. It's something that I've used in other presentations, so some of you might have seen this before or even used it on your own. But it's a simple way to keep track of tricky conversations too. So you talk about worries and give space for that. Then you talk about what's going well in the situation and then what needs to happen. So again, you give space for the worries that need to be debriefed, but then you have an opportunity to move the conversation further so that you're not necessarily stuck in the muck as well. And you give people something to walk away with as well. So that's a really helpful tool there. So I mentioned the word debriefing, and that can be kind of a scary word for some people because it sounds almost like more clinical. But I wanted to reassure everyone that debriefing doesn't require a bunch of letters behind your name or a high degree or anything like that. It's really just giving people a safe, optional space to talk through tricky situations. And I say that because we don't want to force people to ever have to debrief something they're not ready to talk about if we can help it. But it's giving them that option to come together and then making sure that that safety is there and that we're not judging, but we're providing that empathy. So it's really just a structured way to have a conversation and think about a tough situation. And then a big piece of this is about collaborating. So we work with staff as almost like a team member. We're kind of taking away that power differential. And I listed some questions that hopefully you guys could all just copy and use in your conversations even today, headed out into the field. So when you're processing a really tough situation, focusing on what worked well, did anything work out, did anything to surprise you? What progress did you make with the child? What do you think is really happening? So really digging at like the context or the reason behind it. What's required of you? What did you learn from the situation? What do you think would be helpful for step for addressing your worry going forward? And what advice would you give a coworker? So hopefully you can kind of see throughout this that these are all really strengths-based questions and really get to the heart of either power that people had in the situation or power that they still might be able to have to change the situation. So again, helping them kind of get past that feeling of being stuck and then really getting to the point of what can we do about it? What's a feasible thing that we can do about it? It's not sugarcoating it, but what small baby step might we be able to take? And then even asking questions like, what do you think would be the most helpful is, again, really helpful because when you, as a leader or peer, processing all these tough scenarios, you have to be put in a place yourself to take on all the decision making and coming up with a plan yourself. It really has to be that team effort. So having those tools and being able to ask those questions to get deeper is really helpful because you can't fix everything for your staff either. And then the idea of what advice would you give a coworker? That's a really good question to ask too because it has yourself and the person you're talking to really shift perspective. Like think about it from another person's point of view. Take kind of the weight off of you so that you can kind of think about it and hopefully move forward and be more productive with that thinking and that thought process and planning. So another way that we're providing trauma-informed supervision and leadership is through this empowerment, voice, and choice. Again, you can see how these are really building off of one another, blending together. So this piece is about, yes, as leaders or peers, we have to set clear expectations. We have to tell, we have a bottom line, so it might kind of going back to the question in the text box or the chat box. We might have to say, like, our bottom line is we have to get through this day. We have to get back to programming, but this is how we can kind of have this conversation moving forward. This is what we do. But then also making sure the person that has that worry has a huge voice in figuring out what we are going to do about it and finding a way to give them that time and that space. So I like this visual here because like many cultures in the US, we have a culture where men have more power than women. And so in this visual, the man is literally putting down his arms. He's putting down kind of his power and he's thinking and he's listening. And this person with maybe traditional is taking up the speaker and she's sharing information about what she wants to see happen. At least that's how I'm interpreting this picture anyways. And that's really the atmosphere that we want to create with someone who's either a peer or someone we're supervising, so that we're putting down, we know we inherently might have more power or to facilitate or even power to make decisions. We're setting that aside, we're recognizing our privilege, and then we're asking them the questions and giving them that space. This is another slide that's really important too, and a really concrete gauge that you can kind of check yourself in these situations is just monitoring, are you listening more than you're talking? Because again, when you're posed with really complex situations or an ethical dilemma, you have to make a really tough decision about a kid in programming or a family. The temptation is to just go to problem solving and get it done and figure it out. But if we really want to give others power and voice, we need to step back. And so it's really good gauge to make sure you might be asking questions or facilitating a conversation, but you're making sure that you literally hear that person speak more words than you speak in those instances. And then this is a really good segue from the last slide as well, because in order to be trauma-informed, we want to recognize intersectionality. So we have to understand that culture, background, gender, other identities, they intersect. And so we have to understand that past trauma that our staff has experienced, just like our video demonstrates, or comes to this work with this whole past and carrying your experience as a child. And so do a lot of our workers. So we recognize that the past, the culture, the experiences of our staff are going to intersect with the stressors that they come in contact in programming. We recognize that that's not their fault. There is nothing to blame, but that is going to impact them, and it's going to change the way we need to support and advocate for our staff and our peers. So unfortunately, historical and cultural trauma are much more prevalent than any of us would like to, or more than we can sometimes even conceptualize, but we have to take these complexities into consideration. And in these next slides, I have a couple examples where I was hoping people would throw some ideas in the chat or even unmute. But I think because we've got a quieter group today, I'll just kind of let you guys think through these. And if there's any questions, we can maybe walk through them that way. But I kind of wanted to hear from you guys. So if you do feel comfortable, feel free to still put it in there. So you're going to run into these situations. A worker with a domestic violence history is triggered by a child who's more aggressive with her than with other staff. A staff who saw her son removed from her home by a police officer for a crime he didn't commit is yelled at by a father who also is in a position of power in the community. And a staff member whose grandparents were forcibly removed from their reservation is working with a child who disclosed abuse, and she has to make a report to CPS, which could ultimately end in removal. So I think I picked pretty black and white examples of how different identities and different experiences could intersect and play into these things. So feel free, like I said, to put ideas in the chat of how you might support staff through these situations. But I think this is a good opportunity to pause and kind of revisit some of the things we've been talking about. So in that first scenario, that might be an example where we need to give that worker a break, right? We might need to be able to say, like, are you in overwhelm right now, and provide that support and be vulnerable with them and make sure we're providing that. The second one, that might be an example where we really need to be an ally, and it might be a really hard conversation with that dad in that situation, but to support our staff, we're going to make sure that we're there having those conversations and protecting and advocating and making sure that even though we're serving them, that client and that family that we're serving is respectful of our bottom line and of our policies around trauma-informed care. That last one would maybe be a good opportunity where we sit side by side with staff and we make that call with them. And then we come up with a plan for how we're going to follow up and check in on them the following week or the following months, depending on how things progress. And we make sure that we're checking in and processing those things with that worker. Kathy, is there anything filtering in that would be helpful for this part of the conversation?
Nope, we're still a pretty quiet group over here.
Okay, thanks, Kathy. So another piece about how we want to support staff is this idea of resiliency. And I have some, now that I see them bigger, they're not so attractive pictures up here, but I wanted to bring this up. because a lot of times people talk about resiliency almost like a Nerf ball where a bad thing happens to someone, but it's okay, they'll bounce back, like they'll literally bounce back. And you hear this a lot with kids in particular because people will say, oh, they're young, they'll bounce back. And we talked a little bit about the brain before, and definitely the brain can change and people are resilient and they get through things. But the idea here is that no, they're not ever going to get back to that original shape. And resiliency is more like, for lack of a better visual, this metal hanger where something can happen, a trauma can happen, a stress can happen, people get bent out of shape, and you can get it bent back to almost the same form it was. It can still become useful and an amazing tool for you, but it's never going to be exactly how it was. And so we want to bring that out here because we want to be realistic and in how we help build resiliency in our staff. We can't just expect people to bounce back and say like, oh, they're tough, they've been through this, they've been in the field 20 years, they'll bounce back. They're young, they have lots of energy, they can deal with this stress. Because in reality, we have to help them get back to shape where they feel like they can still be useful and productive in their jobs.
So there's a question, Rachel, can I throw it to you?
Yep.
What advice would you give staff who are afraid of having these hard conversations because they're afraid of saying something that might be offensive to someone else?
Ooh, that's a really good conversation. My mind is going a couple different directions because I can guess there might be different reasons for this question, like coming out of our intersectionality slide, it might have something to do with that. So I don't know exactly where this question is coming from, and feel free to enter more. But I think a lot of it goes back to building that safe space and having that conversation up front. So like the purpose of our conversation isn't to have perfect language or anything like that. People make mistakes. We all do, and have that conversation up front. But to process that in a way, you're not going to be judged in here. And the purpose of this conversation is that we want to make you feel safe and work through this problem. And we can work on finding tools together so that you do have language that makes you feel like you can be effective and things like that. And that would be another good opportunity to check in with staff about other things that might make them feel comfortable. And it might be having a peer there like we talked about. Or it might even be an honest conversation about certain people they don't want in the room. It might be they feel more comfortable having a conversation with someone else and not you, and that's okay. And making sure that that is also known to them as well. And then again, too, I think that's a good opportunity to talk about, like, we don't always have all the options either. And I think people want to be politically correct, but we don't always have all the solutions. But just being vulnerable about that, we're not perfect either, but we will work on finding resources and training to follow up on those worries as well. So I don't know if I've ever had a day in my career where I didn't wish there was like an equation where I could like plug a problem in and just spit out exactly how much of something I needed to administer and like get a kid back on track or support a staff. And it's funny because I don't think I'm a good math person at all, but the closest I've come to is this one. So we're talking about resiliency. So I was proud because I was able to actually put this into a simple equation. So resiliency is really about regulation plus connection. Those are the two elements, going back to Bruce Perry, who is that researcher and is really well known in the trauma field. That's what he talks about. In order to make sure, whether it's kids, families, or staff that we're talking about, in order to get them through chronic stress and traumatic situations, we need to make sure people are just baseline regulated and that they have opportunities for that connection, just like that whole series we went through on how to connect with our staff. So digging into this a little bit more, there's another sciencey type slide up here. So just to throw this up here and remind people that the way our bodies and our brains take information is sequential. And so what that means is we're constantly taking in information all the time. As you sit here, you can probably think of how you're processing the light from your computer, the sounds in the room next to you, all these things are constantly coming in. And the way our brains process that is from the bottom up. So from the regions of our brain that developed way back eons and centuries ago, all the way up to those newer brain versions. And so what that means is if something is dangerous or stressful, our processing and our functioning can kind of get stuck in those lower level brain modes. And so what that means is like our temperature might be off, as you can see to the right of the slide. Our heartbeat might be racing if we're in stress mode. Our blood pressure is kind of going wonky. We might be not sleeping as good or eating as well. And this slide I just throw in here again to go back to that idea of regulation, because if people don't have their needs met on that lower level, then it's going to be really hard, as you can kind of see in this inverted triangle, to get up to that point where we can have abstract thought, concrete thought, and really work through tough situations. So if a staff or a peer comes to you and they're super dysregulated and distraught by the situation, it doesn't make sense and it's not supportive. It's not trauma-informed to jump into problem solving. We got to make sure that, again, people are feeling safe and regulated. And the second part of that equation is going back to that idea of connection. So these are two quotes from Brené Brown. She's a researcher and a social worker. And she talks about how trust is earned in the smallest moments. So again, it's nothing grand that we're doing, but it's in those everyday check-ins, just those everyday genuine situations with our teams. And then she emphasized the point that we're just hardwired to connect. That is literally how we survive. It's what we're intended to do as humans, is connect to other humans. And that's how we thrive and get through tough situations. So putting those two things into practice, I wanted to give you guys, again, some really concrete ideas, like how do we actually carry this out in programming today, or how do we operationalize this? So ways that we give opportunities for other people to regulate, even adults. One of the ways is we include rhythm. So this is the simple thing, like offering, like if we're staffing a tough situation, to say, let's go for a walking session. Or giving people an opportunity to even take a 10-minute break to do something like that, physical, that helps regulate their body before we have a tough situation. That can make a huge impact. Again, kind of going back to this idea of a mindfulness moment, an opportunity for people to pause. This can look different for everyone, and I would recommend giving or having a conversation with individual staff on what this might look like for them, because it might be just a break at a desk or an office or in the gym, but it might be like, let's play a upbeat song or something before we start a hard conversation. So it can look a lot of different ways, and it does not by any means have to be sitting on a yoga mat, meditating to a long meditation. Another thing that's that we can do is the same safe spaces that we talk about in programming to create for kids. We create in our offices or in the spaces where we're having these tough conversations. So we have stress balls, we have coloring books, we have sand. I know when I was in child welfare and I was a supervisor, these things were always front and center on my desk. And I can't tell you how many times people came in and I don't think they even realized, but they were playing in the sand or they were coloring while they were having these tough conversations. And again, that was just something that was helping those lower levels of the brain to regulate and keep on track so that they could use the higher levels of the brain and kind of process through tough information. And then make it okay to take breaks, reschedule, ask those questions about what makes them feel safe. And then another big one is just supplying for basic needs. Probably not the best, healthiest example, but another thing I always did as a supervisor is keep a huge jar of peanut M&Ms on my desk, a little protein, a little sugar, because people would often come in and they're not taking care of themselves or slowing down to even make sure they're filling their bellies or using the restroom. So making sure people have a chance to just meet their basic needs and emphasizing that and pushing that in front of them so that they know that's a priority for you can be a huge difference. Another example of that is just even having a blanket available, because as you saw in the previous slides, people in stressful situations, sometimes they're hot, sometimes they're cold, sometimes they need that weight, and people will automatically wrap themselves up in that if they need it, sometimes without even thinking about it. When we're getting close to time, so I'm going to kind of hurry up through this last part of the slide here, but making sure we have those those continual ritual questions, those opportunities for connection and well-being. Checking in on work-life balance, so asking people questions, aside from the problem solving you have to do, but asking questions like, are you taking this home? Are you sleeping good at night? And having those genuine conversations. And then being able to problem solve around it. Like, we're not going to solve, like, if someone can't sleep at night, but we can have conversations with them about, like, how can you decompress? Like, what can you do on your drive home? What can we do here? How can we give you a break? And then making sure you follow up on those things that you say you're going to do to help them. Again, inviting others in for additional support, demonstrating when you need assistance so that that makes it a safe place for them. You can even say, like, I don't know how to say this perfectly. Kind of going back to that other question, but demonstrating you might not have all the answers and they don't have to either. And then checking our own stories that we're telling ourselves. So the story I'm telling myself is this: what are you really experiencing? Because when we're getting bombarded with these tough questions, it's easy for us to start to, our mind is going to want to make shortcuts too. And we might start to put qualifiers around the staff we're working with. Oh, if only the staff could just get over the situation, or, you know, they're just being lazy. We don't want to go to those places. And so making sure that we're checking our own dialogue in our head too. And then documenting things that come up, because if you're able to remember the conversation you had and then following up on it that next week, that shows how much you care to your staff too. And I don't know about you, but I can't remember everything. So writing it down is helpful. And then you know to circle back and continue having that conversation. And then Colton, I'm going to skip over this last part of it because I think we're running out of time. So I'm going to go to my next slide. So I was going to show you guys another clip from Laura Vanderlipsky, but essentially these last slides summarize what she was saying too. And we can't have a whole conversation on supporting other teammates and peers and staff that we might be leading without also giving credit to the space and the time and the energy that it takes for you as a leader to also take care of yourself. And so I had to throw this in here. This is a tool directly from Laura. She calls it the 5 directions, and she uses like the earth elements, air, water, fire, things like that to kind of depict it. But when you look a little closer at it, it can be a really helpful, useful tool. Because as a leader, if you're feeling overwhelmed and just like things are out of control, you know you might need to use some of these grounding exercises. So practicing compassion, checking in maybe with your own supports or your own mentors, that's kind of an indicator that you need to do those things. If you're feeling like things are just kind of blowing past you, you can use this as a tool to say, like, maybe now is the time I need to think about gratitudes and like kind of reframe what's going on in my programming. So this can be a really helpful tool. And to kind of wrap up, what we're talking about overall today is this idea of trauma stewardship. So, you know, coming away from this, I don't expect everyone to memorize all the different elements, all the different specific strategies, but it's just this idea that we practice daily. We try to get through these daily challenges where we recognize that like pain and trauma are real. And we recognize that suffering can be transformed. So really highlighting those main parts of that quote here. So trauma, stress, it's going to come up when we work in these situations, when we're caring for others and we're seeing kids and families in pain. But knowing that as an agency and as an individual and a leader, that we are willing to work through these things is really the main idea. We're not going to have a magical solution overnight, but if we're willing to do it, we can transform some of that pain into really good stuff. So kind of thinking back to that original question, or the original slide where I posed all those questions to all of you to reflect on, and thinking, do my staff and the people I work with feel safe? Do they feel heard? Do they feel supported by one another? You can see how all of those things really connect back to this main idea of trauma stewardship. And I wanted to put up here a couple people that I think of when I think of stewards of trauma that you all might recognize too. So on here we've got Mother Teresa, we've got David Attenborough, Dorothea Dick, Sojourner Truth, Frances Perkins, Jane Goodall is up there. I think if anything, the one that people might be less familiar with is Frances Perkins. She's the one here on the bottom right in the black and white picture. And she actually, many people don't know, but she is the brains and the brawn behind a lot of FDR's policies that changed the United States. A lot of the policies behind the New Deal. And she actually saw a lot of pain and trauma in kids that were working in factories that did a lot of work around child labor laws. And so you could argue that she actually is one of the reasons why we have after school and out of time programs, because she made sure kids had laws that were protecting them and safe. So when I think of this idea of trauma stewardship and just how sometimes we all need that little bit of inspiration, I think of her and how she took something really hard and made it into something that was really positive and sparked a lot of other change along the way. And then I think because this is such a quiet group, I'm not going to do the word cloud, but just wanted to end on this note for you guys to consider why you are a steward of trauma. So just thinking of these questions, like why are you here? What drives you? And then what drives them, as in the staff you're either working with on your team or the staff that you're leading. And kind of taking that forward with you as you consider all the stuff we went over today. And feel free, any last comments in the chat, we'd appreciate it, but we won't force you. All right, Kathy.
Super. Well, thank you, Rachel. That was always helpful information, especially during these really challenging times. If you have further questions regarding today's webinar, please email the Wisconsin After School Network at the email address provided in the chat box. More information about the series of professional development opportunities in addition to this learning series can be found on the Wisconsin After School Network website, and the web address will also be posted to the chat box. Our next webinar will be on May 13th, I believe that is a week from today, with Matthew Cook, whose focus is on developing positive coping skills in times of challenge and adversity. If any of you were on the day camp series a year ago, Matthew was one of our presenters during that day camp series as well. This 90-minute session begins at 11 a.m. We encourage you to participate in this series as we all continue to work to provide quality out-of-school time opportunities for kids and families. Thank you for your participation on today's webinar and the work that you do on behalf of the children and families in the state of Wisconsin. Enjoy the weekend, enjoy the weather. Thanks, everyone.